Welcome everybody to another computer build log. This time we're going back to the standards. We're building a simple mid-tower ATX computer. Nothing special like the wall mounts I've been doing in the past. Now there may be some of you who have seen my previous build log where I built a 4-foot square wall-mounted panel complete with a mineral oil loop and 30 feet of RGB lighting. Since then, I've decided to take it down and consolidate my computer components in a regular mid-tower ATX case. There is a reason that I did this, mainly because that case was a bit too big after a while. It was a bit of a pain to maintain, and quite frankly, I wanted to soundproof the wall that it was mounted to. For these reasons, I decided to do a simple build this time around. For the build, I chose Thermaltake's View 27 mid-tower ATX case, primarily because I'm an enthusiast for wanting to show off my components, and the window provided by the case allows for such desire. I also chose this case because it allows for the video card to be mounted on its side via a PCIe riser cable, which is something that I've always wanted and is quite difficult to find in cases these days. One more item that I did want to add was a 240mm liquid cooler, and I did so for the build. One challenge for this build was the fact that the case only supports up to 3 SSDs and 2 hard drives. Meanwhile, I have 3 SSDs and 4 hard drives, so we shall see how I surpass this obstacle as we continue. The first objective that I needed to complete was disassembling the old wall-mounted panel by removing all of the components from it. This was pretty straightforward, but it took a little bit of time due to the fact that the size of the panel was so freaking large. What I did first was disconnect everything and gather up all the cables before even attempting to remove the components. Then, as you may have guessed, I removed the components from the plexiglass panels that they were mounted on. Before I began to install all of the components into the case, I wanted to address the aesthetics because I wasn't completely satisfied by the design of said case. The first objective for the aesthetics was to paint the trim of the front case panel a metallic gold, because I love gold. To accomplish this, I removed all the front panel I/O and the acrylic front window. What I was left with was the trim of the front panel. Of course, I didn't want to paint all of the trim gold, so I had to apply a generous amount of masking tape to cover the areas that I wanted to keep black. Once completed, I first added a layer of plastic primer to the trim. This primer was white and would allow the gold to pop better. Once dried, I then applied 2 coats of metallic gold. While that was drying, I decided to work on the carbon fiber vinyl wrap for the side panels of the case. If you have seen my previous build logs, you know that all of my builds feature carbon fiber. To accomplish this, I used the same technique from the other build logs where you stretch the wrap over the area that you want to cover, and using a knife, cut out the unwanted areas, and fold all of the remaining wrap behind the panel. For the forwardmost side panel, I had to remove the acrylic window before applying. Another task that I wanted to finish before installing the components was to install the RGB LEDs in the case. My plan for this was a simple run where a strip would exist at the bottom and top of the inside of the main section of the case. Then have that run also go into the front panel section where it lined the inside of the trim in order to shine light onto the hex design inside the acrylic front window. One thing that I did not plan for was the fact that the light shined through the front panel side ventilation grates, but it wasn't a huge issue in the end. Once that was completed, it was finally time to install the components. First was the power supply. I have an EVGA Supernova 750 watt fully modular power supply, which was installed in the separated basement of the case in the back. The cables were then attached and fed through the case when installing the corresponding components. Next, I did my motherboard preparation. Being that I bought a liquid cooler for the build, I needed to remove my old cooler from the board, clean the processor, and install the new cooler. The liquid cooler I purchased was an Intermax LickMax 2 240mm all-in-one liquid cooler. I chose it mainly for its reasonable price, but also because of its beefy CPU block. Installing the cooler is as simple as it always is. Clean the CPU, apply the thermal compound, in this case Arctic Silver 5, and mount the block using the given hardware. Once the motherboard preparation was completed, it was time to install it into the case. One thing I like about this case is the fact that the massive window on it takes away from a static top section where fans would normally be. So when you remove the side panel, you also remove the top panel because it's one piece. This allows for a lot of room and the ability to get your hands at the top of the motherboard to fish cables and such, which is something that is quite difficult in other normal towers. For the install, it was a simple matter of aligning the board with the correct holes, fishing the cables from the power supply up to the designated connectors, and plugging in fans and the liquid cooler. Next was the SSDs. Now, I'm going to explain what I did for this. I originally had just 2 SSDs from SanDisk that I used as my boot partition, but since this case has 3 forward-mounting SSD locations, I thought it would be odd to not have 3 SSDs filling those spaces. So, I grabbed my old laptop's SSD and threw it in there with the others to fill the remaining space. This was also handy because it allowed for more storage for the boot partition than before, being that all 3 SSDs are in RAID 0. The install was lucky, really, because there's just enough space in between the wall and the liquid cooler to fit an SSD in between. To accomplish this installation, it's a simple matter of screwing in the SSDs and running the SATA cables and wiring up the power. After that, I went ahead and quickly ran and plugged in the front panel I/O and installed the bottom-mounted fan, which would pull up air from the bottom of the case and into the main section. Also, one thing to note, I wasn't using a standard computer RGB kit. I used a separate kit meant for wall outlets, so I had to jerry-rig a Molex to 12-volt pin power connector to power the LED controller. It worked out quite well. Once done, it was time to install the glorious sideways-mounted graphics card. This was achieved by purchasing and installing Thermaltake's specialized PCIe riser meant for this case specifically. It ran from the motherboard down, then up into this special bracket that held the receiving end of the PCIe slot via bolts. Then all you had to do was plug in the graphics card normally and screw it in. Once in, I ran the GPU power cables from the power supply up into the main section and into the graphics card. All that was left was the installation of the 4 hard drives, the cable management, and installing the front panel. In the beginning of this video, I mentioned that this case only supported up to 2 hard drives. To combat this, I decided to take out the hard drive cage that is located in the separated basement of the case. Then, using thick-mounted foam tape, I stacked the hard drives in the basement. Fortunately, there was just enough room for 2 sets of hard drives, the power supply, and the cables for everything. Now, this isn't something that is typically done, but sometimes you're left with little options for builds like this. Cable management was done during the installation of the hard drives. Nothing too fancy was done, I just ran cables in a semi-organized fashion along the backside of the wall. Then moving on to the last bit of work for the case was the installation of the front panel that I had painted earlier. All I had to do for that was reinstall the front panel I/O that I removed for the painting and snap it back on to the front of the case. Finally, we're done with the building, but first was the ever so fun first time boot up, and as always, it booted the first time. We move on to the installation of Windows, which is always fun, right? First, I had to set up the storage arrays. Now for the boot partition, which is the 3 SSDs from earlier, I had to enable Intel's RAID controller, then set up the RAID array via Intel's RAID boot menu. The storage setup for the hard drives would be done later in Windows. Once completed, it was time to install Windows itself onto the boot partition. This was accomplished via a USB flash drive installation. When I finally got into Windows, I began to install all of my software and benchmarking tools, but first, I had to set up the hard drives via Windows Partition Manager by creating a striped array between the 4 hard drives. This gave me a total of 12 terabytes of hard drive storage. After that, I began to run my thermals and thermal monitoring software. Running stress tests, I watched how my system temperatures acted. In the beginning, I was having some difficulty keeping the graphics card cool because, being that this case does not have an outtake at the top with fans, it's much harder to cool the system. I solved this by adding a push-pull fan configuration using 2 fans at the back that shot in cool air from the back into the case and out the front. This configuration brought the GPU thermals down almost 20 degrees Celsius, and the CPU always ran cool with it never going above 50 degrees Celsius, even with the hotter air being shot at it. After finally solving the thermals issue, it was time to run the 3D Mark benchmark. Running Firestrike, the system received a generous 10,894 overall score, with a graphics score of 13,459, a physics score of 10,169, and a combined score of 4,691. And just to give you the specs of the system for reference, It includes an Intel Xeon E3 1231V3 processor, running on an ASUS Sabertooth Z97 Mark I motherboard with 32GB of EVGA superclocked DDR3 RAM, an ASUS Strix RX 480 8GB graphics card, 400GB of RAID 0 PNY and SanDisk SSDs, 12TB of Seagate hard drives, each 3TB big, an Intermax LickMax 2 240mm all-in-one liquid cooler, all running on an EVGA Supernova 750W fully modular gold power supply, with everything, and I mean everything, in Thermaltake's View 27 mid-tower ATX case. Soon, though, I will be upgrading to Ryzen, so be expecting a video of that upgrade when it occurs. So that's it, another build down, and another one to look forward to in the future, but until then, please enjoy these beautiful shots of the new system.